This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, my guest is Dr. Jeremy Everett, founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. We explore Dr. Everett's calling towards eradicating hunger, his work with various organizations, and his personal experiences that shaped his career. Our discussion includes Dr. Everett's efforts in creating initiatives like the Hunger-Free Communities Model and Meals to You program, which has significantly impacted food insecurity in rural America. We also touch on the significance of solidarity, the intersection of political and spiritual issues in hunger, and strategies for effective community collaboration. Dr. Everett emphasizes the role of various sectors working together and the importance of relationships and policy advocacy in their ongoing efforts to end hunger. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today I'm joined by Jeremy Everett. Dr. Jeremy Everett is the founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. With nearly 100 staff, interns, and researchers, the Baylor Collaborative team has assisted community-based, state-based, and national efforts to increase hundreds of millions of additional meals through innovative, research-based interventions. In Dr. Everett's tenure with the collaborative, he has raised more than $300 million to support faculty research, public service, and policy analysis. Dr. Everett earned a bachelor's degree from Samford University, a Master of Divinity from Truett Seminary at Baylor University, and his Doctor of Ministry from Duke Divinity School at Duke University, and was appointed by U.S. Congress in 2014 to serve on the National Commission on Hunger. He is the author of I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis, and is a contributing author to several other books, including the recently published book, What Justice Looks Like. Jeremy is married to Amy, and they have 3 sons, Lucas, Sam, and Wyatt. So thanks for joining me today, Jeremy. Really feel privileged and honored to have this conversation.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to spending some time with you this afternoon.
So I want to start here because in your book, you mentioned just this call to, devote your life to ending hunger. And so what was that call look like? What led you to this vocation?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we've got now our older boys are in college, and our youngest son is finishing up elementary school. But I still think in moons. Like when they were kids, it's like, how many moons ago was that, Dad? And when you ask that question, I'm like, man, that feels like many moons ago. All of us, I think every human being on the planet knows what it's like to feel like an outsider at some point. And so for me, growing up as a kid, we moved around a lot. My father was a minister. Most of my family members are ministers. And we joked that my dad only had 3 years worth of sermons. And so we would pick up and move a good bit. And so anytime you're a new kid, you know what life looks like on the outside. And you're just desperate to find those friends that will let you in. A point of uniqueness for me was that I played basketball through high school, and so many of my friends came from high poverty urban communities, and that I played basketball with. But then the churches that my father pastored oftentimes were the First Baptist Church of America kind of a church, and so I might have friends whose families lived at country clubs, and so it wouldn't be uncommon for me to maybe go play basketball in the projects, and then the same day go to a friend's house in the country club, and I, as a child, I didn't really think anything about it. That was just life. But when I got to college, the reality of the inequities that I experienced as a kid began to emerge, and I began to see people who are economic outsiders for a variety of reasons. I didn't know really what to do about that. I asked a lot of ministers about like what does that mean, and
Hmm.
most of them said you should feel grateful for the resources that you grew up with, that you didn't have a hard time putting food on the table and so forth. And I knew that that was probably truth for most people, but it wasn't truth for me at that time. And later in college, I came across the story of St. Francis of Assisi, and it was a game changer for me. I was a Baptist kid at a Baptist school and turned on the TV and watched a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon
Hmm.
about Francesco. And I didn't even know that Francesco was St. Francis until a few months after that. But it just told this story of a young man who realized that um, that he needed to give away all of his possessions because his possessions were prohibiting him from loving his neighbor as himself. And it's not just possessions; it's the quest. It's what it represents in terms of status and creating insiders and outsiders and so forth. And when I came across that story, it resonated to me, and so I got all my stuff in my little car and loaded it all up, and I drove over the mountain in Birmingham to downtown Birmingham, where a lot of the civil rights activity happened at Kelly Ingram Park, and that's where a lot of the homeless hung out when I was in college. And so I gave away all my possessions, and at that point, I knew I was called to people in poverty. I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
I'd never heard of social work. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was for me is I needed to move into low income communities so I could see what poverty looked like from inside out.
Wow. That's so cool. And so how have you maintained that call through, many moons? We won't ask how many moons, but like, like it's one thing to have that experience in college. We've all have some, radical stories of calling. It feels like in college, if, we follow Jesus, but like how to maintain that, like how has your soul remained engaged and not grown maybe bitter or resentful?
That's a great question. Well, first, Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy and Civil Rights
Yeah.
Attorney, we paraphrase him all the time. And he says you can't solve a social problem from a distance. You have to have proximity to the problem.
Yeah.
And so for about 2 decades, we lived in low-income communities. First, as a single adult, as a seminary student, living with other seminary students in a high-poverty neighborhood, and then getting married and then raising our family. We lived in high-poverty neighborhoods for most of my adult life. Not now. Now we found a house in the woods that we live in, but it that helps. I
Yeah.
mean, you're surrounded by beautiful people, getting to know people from very different walks of life than I had known before. The experiences that we had in some of these communities rooted my faith experience and the realities of hunger and poverty on on kind of a day-to-day life. And then I think staying connected to a faith community has helped. I think there are a number of confluencing factors, having mentors and people
Right.
that you invest in and that invest in you. But I think a number of those things, but probably most importantly, was proximity and still trying to figure out ways to maintain proximity even if we don't live in communities. It reminds you of like, okay, so why am I doing this? This
Yeah.
is and I had an opportunity to meet Gustavo Gutierrez.
Oh,
Father
wow.
Gutierrez, kind of the godfather of liberation theology.
Yeah.
I had graduated from seminary. My wife and I were living on a small communal organic farm in North Waco called World Hunger Relief Institute. And this Father Gutierrez was leaving Peru, where he'd been a priest for most of his life, and going to Notre Dame to be a professor for the final stage of his life. And he came and gave a lecture series at Baylor. And a Baylor professor invited me over to his home to celebrate his birthday. And if you know anything about, Gustavo Gutierrez, he's a giant. He's one of these people. It's like a giant human being. Like you just expect him to be a larger than life character.
Right.
But it turns out he's like a 3.5 foot Peruvian Yoda like individual. And I felt like he was like 350 years old when I met him. I'm
Hmm.
6'4". I mean, he probably was not 5 foot.
Wow.
And I just remember having an opportunity while we were gathered at my professor's house to be able to ask him a question that had been burning on my mind. I said, "How do you have solidarity with the poor?" And he said, "You commit your life to their cause."
Hmm.
And that stuck with me. And it's like, okay, this is not a short-term thing.
No.
And I may have different jobs over the course of my life, different articulations of what commitment to the poor looks like, but this is a lifetime cause and a lifetime call. So that was one of those very clarifying moments about what I was getting myself into, and grateful for that.
No. How cool to have that moment with such a profound thinker, who's shaped, you know,
Yeah,
uh, shaped so many people. Um,
yeah, he's an amazing dude. Uh, I even felt like he, like talked like Yoda,
I'm sure.
verbs or nouns, and
Yeah,
yeah, what an amazing character. Just passed away this past year,
that's
and
right.
but a giant of a human being for sure.
Yeah. And we've lost some great thinkers this past year, from Gustavo to Walter Brueggemann, people who have shaped
Yeah,
Christian thought, um, and to read their works and to be like, okay, how do we carry on their legacy and their thought, in these times is important.
that's right. That's right. Bill Moyers, died last
Yeah.
week too. Or 2 weeks ago. Yep. So yep, that's wild. I hadn't thought about it all happening this year.
Yeah. But you mentioned a word like solidarity, and it's a word, like, as I've done this podcast, it's a word more than a few guests keep mentioning, and especially as we think about the poor, this disenfranchised, the oppressed. Why is solidarity such an important word as we think then about hunger specifically versus just a handout, and what does solidarity mean to you, and why might it be an important concept as we engage with hunger?
Yeah. In all these years, I don't think I've ever had anybody ask me that question, and that's a very thoughtful question. I appreciate you asking that. Um, here are a couple thoughts. One, solidarity, I think, is a commitment to justice.
Hmm.
It's a commitment to making crooked paths straight.
Hmm.
And so, right now, our farmers and ranchers in our nation and around the world produce enough food to ensure that nobody should go hungry.
Wow.
Yet we have 750 million people on the planet that are on the brink of starvation.
Hmm.
We consistently have 35 to 40 million Americans that are considered food insecure. And to me, when we have enough food, when we're producing enough food, one thing if there's a famine, right? You know,
Yeah.
this isn't famine related. That means that we don't. Well, let me put it like this: if you have the resources, you can probably get any type of food you want anywhere in the world you are at almost any time of the day that you want.
Hmm.
But if you don't have the resources, or you live in a community that doesn't have the resources, or a country that doesn't have the resources, your ability to get your basic needs met or access to affordable, healthy food is severely limited. And so, since, for people who come from a faith perspective, from a Christian faith perspective specifically, we think about us all being created in the image of God. And if we really believe that, and one of the first things that God says to Adam and Eve is gives them food to eat,
Yeah.
that eating is central to our human experience, specifically eating with other people,
Hmm.
right? It's
Yeah.
central to our human experience. And we don't ensure that everybody has access to that resource
Hmm.
that they need to live as God intended for them to live, then that means that we must not really value people as being as fully human as we value ourselves or our family members.
Huh.
And so while hunger is a political problem, uh, it's also rooted in a spiritual issue. And so solidarity to me is saying we are going to commit to justice.
Yeah.
And we are going to work to ensure that we are building infrastructure so that everybody has a pathway to get to that table
Mm-hmm.
to eat together as God intended for us to be able to enjoy the bounty of all that's being grown and produced. And so so that probably, is I'll have to think about it more, honestly. That's a great question, but to me that's probably what solidarity looks like.
Hmm.
It's that commitment to justice. Charity's great, right? Doing
Yeah.
something, providing food to somebody today when you see pass by a homeless person on the street, that's great. That is a good thing.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like solidarity is probably more in line with a commitment to justice and working towards that end.
Mm-hmm. To justice, to flourishing, to seeing that, God's shalom,
Yeah.
is on earth as it is in heaven.
Yep.
Um,
100%. Yep.
And you made a comment that I'd love for you to unpack a little. You said that hunger is a political and spiritual issue. Be curious, how you see both working hand in hand, just because I think for listeners, people think of it, okay, well, the government needs to do more or just the church needs to do more. But how do you see both government and religious organization, churches, faith communities, working to address hunger?
Yeah. Well, uh, got a lot of thoughts here, but
Yeah.
first and foremost, um, hunger and poverty are not are too big and too complex for any one sector to end by themselves.
Yep.
So, and what that means is that it inherently requires government to play a role, congregations to play a role, nonprofits to play a role, industry partners, even academia,
Yeah.
should play a role. So it's like it literally requires all of us working in concert with each other to be able to bend that crooked path and make it straight.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that is also unique. That not maybe not unique, um, but poignant. That at a time of fragmentation as a nation, as a planet, um, that our only pathway forward for food security or to end hunger is for us to work together. And but it's available to us. That's what's so amazing. Is like we have a vision that's a world without hunger,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, people ask me all the time, do you really think you can end hunger? It's like, well, we produce enough food. So since we produce enough food, yeah, we can very much end hunger, and it really is as simple as us working together and prioritizing it
Mm-hmm.
and developing strategies and building the infrastructure to be able to make it so. So ending hunger is very doable.
Wow.
It just is a matter. It's a issue of will. It's
Mm-hmm.
an issue of making it a value and a leave behind that we were like, hey, we want to leave the planet better than we found it, and this is part of it, right? The
Right.
people having access to the food that they need to live as God intended. But it does require everybody to work together. So the government has to plays a very important role. There are really kind of three things right now that I would say are kind of the three big buckets of how you end hunger, like in America, for example. One
Right.
would be uh, uh, the role of farmers and agribusiness. So that has to be strong and healthy.
Yeah.
So if we're doing things that are going to reduce our ability to produce food down the road because of how we plant or how we, what we put on our fields and whatnot, well, that's not going to be that's not a good long-term solution, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but farm and agribusiness has to be strong. Our government federal nutrition programs like SNAP that
Yeah.
we've seen talked about a whole lot right now with big beautiful bill stuff have to be strong. Those are of critical importance and have the biggest impact on food security in America. And then the charitable food distribution has to be strong. So Feeding America and the network of food banks all of our congregations that have food pantries. What most people don't know is that most of that food is also federally funded food through the Emergency Food Care Program called, or TFAP, one of USDA's federal nutrition programs. And so, or Meals on Wheels. You think about that, it's a great program.
Right.
Also federally funded programs, right? But we think about that as the charitable food system. So all three of those have to be rocking and rolling. And then we've developed a fourth called Hunger-Free Communities. And that's our vehicle to get all the different sectors working in concert with each other to transform access on a local community or in a state level. So if all four of those things are happening, then we are well on a path forward to food security.
That sounds easy, and you make it sound like, okay, this, which is, I love that you said that hunger is an issue we can solve because we have enough food to feed everybody. It's now a willingness to make sure that that food gets to where it needs to get into those communities, whether it's food deserts, whether it's the indigenous population, and yet it's multiple organizations working together, and you talk about collective impact, and so like, how do multiple organizations then work together to do this, and what does that mean? Because I think it's one thing to say, oh, we just got to get people in the same room to end hunger, but I think the way you describe it, it's something more than just that. And I think that's where maybe your work at Baylor is coming into play here.
That's right. So there's organizing is an art and a science, right?
Right.
And so the science behind it is utilizing what we call a shared power theory of change. And basically what that means is that everybody should have a seat at the table and be involved in being a part of the solution. And that should be, all those different sectors that I mentioned should be at the table. Families who live in poverty should be at the table. If you don't listen to people who are directly impacted by food insecurity, you're going to build a boat that won't float.
Right.
And but they oftentimes don't just need to be representing the fact that they're in poverty. They're probably leading organizations in impoverished communities. They could be a pastor in a low-income community, and maybe they're bivocational or whatever. But so anyway, so you've got shared power theory of change just means everybody needs to have a seat at the table, and we're going to listen to people who are directly impacted by the issue and prioritize what they have to say. You have to assume that what they're expressing is truth, right?
Yeah.
Collective impact is a strategy by which to put all this together, and it's the process where we guide communities through this hunger-free community model from developing a shared vision towards building a multi-sectoral approach, getting all these groups working together, developing strategic plans, and doing assessments so that you can find out who's doing what and where they're doing it in your community, and so that you're making data-driven decisions, not just decisions based upon anecdotal experience. So it's the best way to do that is go to our website, hungerandpoverty.org. And we are launching a whole new program to be able to train and equip communities that goes live in August. And so you can get a certificate from Baylor in our hunger-free community approach. And that goes live this August. We are committed to ensuring that every county in Texas, so all 254 counties in Texas, have an opportunity to go through this curriculum. And so we are physically going to all 254 counties in Texas between now and 2030. But we also train and equip communities. We have had active projects or research in every county in the U.S. So lots of work there in Arizona over the years. And so this model is in partnership with the Alliance to End Hunger based out of D.C. And so will be made available to communities across the country. So we're excited. So that kind of gives communities who have the desire to end hunger, who have intuited that they can do more together than they can apart.
Right.
The strategies and the process by which to go implement this work, because hunger and poverty weren't created overnight. You're not going to end it, in a year or in a grant cycle. This is something that you need to think in decades. Like, okay,
Right.
what can we achieve over the next decade
Hmm.
to be able to address this in a comprehensive way? So
That's awesome.
yeah,
Yeah. So cool that there is training available, that this isn't just, hey, go figure this out, but that you guys are actively seeking, to make sure that, resources are available for communities that want to do this, and how to, because it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to enter into it and be like, where do I start? And you guys are giving that opportunity for communities, uh, which is awesome.
well, thanks. It large in part thank the communities that were a part of these initial pilots 15
Yeah.
years ago in
Wow.
Texas, because I really was going into communities and saying, all right, work together and figure it out.
Yeah.
And they were like, we're happy to do that, but we don't know how to figure it out. And so it kind of forced our hand to be like, okay, we have to move beyond just the art of organizing and develop
Yeah.
a social science behind it. And because you can't scale art, but you can scale social science.
Hmm.
And our mission is to cultivate scalable solutions in hunger. So we had to figure out how to do it. And our team I'm surrounded by brilliant people who've figured this out, and committed people, and people who are living in communities, working on a day-to-day basis, trying to figure out how to get all these sectors working in concert with each other. And so it was their brilliance that helped create this new platform. So excited to see it launch
For
in
sure.
August.
And as these programs are launched, that's one step, but the other step is this internal work where we've scapegoated, poverty and hunger, and your body reaction to, as soon as I said that, like, you had a reaction, but how do we, we can't change people's hearts, but how do we work to minimize maybe the scapegoating? Like, what can, we as Jesus followers do, or people interested in ending hunger do, to help people understand and stop the scapegoating? Because I think that's a huge issue. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, how many times I've driven past somebody standing at a corner and, had a negative reaction. So, ha-
Yeah,
this is one of the struggles, and, and I'm sure
yeah,
you've heard it and faced it and been told it too many times to count. And so,
yeah, yeah.
uh,
I mean, and done it.
yeah,
I'm uh, I think that's what I get so frustrated with a lot of times is that I've been working in this space for so long, and yet oftentimes I display the same behaviors or thought processes that everybody else does. And so with that, you kind of have to take take everything I say with a grain of salt, because it's not like it's all figured out, and I'm still kind of navigating my way through the darkness myself. But here's what I'll say about scapegoating. First and foremost, one of the earliest records that we have of scapegoating is when Pharaoh scapegoats the slaves, the Hebrew people, the people who become the Hebrew people in the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, when he says they're lazy and they
yeah,
need to go harvest their own straw to make our mud bricks, to build the buildings that he wanted built. We've been scapegoating the poor for thousands and thousands of years. And we do that because if we scapegoat the poor, so like right now, a lot of the language that we're hearing from our members of Congress is, we want people who deserve access to Medicaid or who deserve access to SNAP to have it. We want to protect it for them. We just don't want to give it to people that don't deserve it, or people that are trying to abuse the system. And so we say those things because it abdicates our responsibility to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Mhm.
So if we believe our neighbor is lazy or not doing their part, if we believe that their poverty is their fault, then we don't have to do anything about it. And then we can use our resources, we can create legislation that benefits people that look like us and have similar interests in us, or that provides us the next step in our careers and our quest towards more power and privilege and so forth. It just we're abdicating responsibility. And whereas if we say, "Oof, there's no such thing as deserving and undeserving. There's
Right.
just people in poverty."
Mhm.
So Matthew 25, which is the I Was Hungry book, was named after the Matthew 25 passage. Only eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew,
Hmm.
or end of the world scene.
Yeah.
Jesus returns as king, and he separates everybody, the sheep from the goats, the righteous from the accused. And the criterion for judgment wasn't confession of faith in Christ, which is astonishing.
Yeah.
It was whether or not you acted with love and cared for the needy.
Yeah.
Like those acts weren't extra credit. So that's the only eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew. And the criterion for judgment was Jesus saying, "I was hungry and you gave me food.
Yeah.
I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger or a migrant and you welcomed me. In prison and sick, and you visited me and took care of me," right? But what's interesting about that passage, a lot of us quickly jump to Jesus saying, "Just as you did it to the least of these." And so we all kind of gravitate to the least of these. But it continues to go, and he says, "Who are members of my family."
Hmm. Yeah.
So we remember Father Gutierrez and all that he taught us in his time. Jesus equates people who are in poverty, who are disenfranchised, who Howard Thurman says, whose backs are against the wall, as members of his family. The rest of us are judged based upon whether or not we further their cause.
Yeah.
So certainly that doesn't mean that we're not saved through faith. That there is, but the kingdom has kind of three realities that are continually pointed out: the kingdom within, the kingdom here on earth, and the kingdom of heaven, kind of in the by and by, right? And so, but in this passage, it's speaking about this kingdom on earth, and we are accountable to our brothers and sisters. So when we choose, so in that passage, you can't scapegoat, right? There's
No.
nobody to scapegoat,
No.
and it's just poor. It's just people who are hungry. Doesn't matter why they're hungry, just if they're hungry.
Yeah.
And what do we do or do not do to further their cause? So scapegoating has allowed us to, instead of declaring war on poverty, it's allowed us to declare war on the poor.
Yeah.
Or right now, war on the migrant.
Mm-hmm.
And all I could say is that is antithetical to the gospel. And and so that's so what we're seeing right now in the public life is certainly not in line with what we're seeing in the gospel. I also don't think it's in line with when America's at its best, and I'm happy to talk about that too. But that to me is so scapegoating is but it's been something we all do because we don't want to be responsible for our brother and sister in need.
No. And that's the church my family attends here in Flagstaff has been preaching through James. And James has quite a lot to say about, making sure we care for the hungry, the widows, the orphans. It's James 1:27. Like, this is the pure religion that God finds acceptable, is caring for the orphan and widows in their distress. And I think a lot of times those populations, might have to do with food insecurity.
Yep.
And the access to that. And you think about Acts 6 and, widows not getting fed, the Hellenistic Jews not getting fed, the widows.
Yep.
And so, yeah, like it's this food, taking care and feeding and loving the poor seems to be central to what Jesus calls his followers to. And yet it's so easy to blame them or to dehumanize them versus that moving towards solidarity.
Yep, that's right. Well, what's important to recognize about food security and I've got a book coming out next fall called The Litmus Test. So fall of 26, and the Litmus Test: The Weaponization of Hunger, the Silence of Christians is
Wow.
the book with Baylor Press, and part of the premise there is that you can typically tell the health and well-being of a community based upon the severity and prevalence of hunger.
Hmm.
Because hunger itself is not causal. It is the result of other systemic failures.
Right.
So in the United States, if we see high rates of food insecurity, so in Texas, if we have 18% of our population that is food insecure with an economic boom and a strong ag sector, and we've got some serious then what are these levers? What is contributing to food insecurity that would cause it to be so high in a place that seemingly is doing so well, or in a place like Gaza, right? You see, okay, well, why we got all these children and families who are dying, or in South Sudan, of starvation. What's happening there? Well, obviously conflict, right, is happening there. So if you want to solve for food security, you have to solve for conflict. If you want to solve for food security in Texas, you got to solve for the problem of underemployment, right? You've got to ensure that everybody has access to health care, because those two things are correlative. You got to ensure that people have stable housing, because if they don't have stable housing, if they don't have stable employment, then it's always going to result in food insecurity.
Yeah.
So every poverty-related issue, it's like the funnel is food insecurity. It always results in hunger. So hunger becomes a litmus test. So you can kind of identify the health and well-being of your community based upon the severity and prevalence of hunger. It's not an isolated issue. Sometimes we think 40 million Americans are living below the poverty line. 40 million Americans don't have access to health care. 40 million Americans are food insecure. The reality is it's the same family bearing the weight of all those broken social systems. So, yeah. Anyway, but as we think about it, that's like, okay, that's what we're trying to address in a pretty comprehensive way.
I love what you just said, because it's new. The litmus test of the health of a community is the hunger. And yet solving the hunger isn't just giving them the food; it's addressing the problems that lead to hunger. And so that just raises more questions. But I want to come back to it, because you said, like, America's not operating at its best when we scapegoat the poor. And so it's easy to bash America. It's easy to feel pessimistic about the state of our country, but like, at our best, what do you mean by that? Because I find it hard to be hopeful.
I feel like I have been able to see snippets, I guess.
Right.
Almost like a movie trailer's worth of America at its best,
and
participate in it. And FDR has his famous quote, the test of our progress isn't whether we provide more to those who have an abundance, but whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And I feel like every policymaker in Washington, every policymaker at every state legislative office, anybody working on policy needs to print that above the door. It's like the Notre Dame runs out, they have the Be a Champion thing. It's like you need to hit that every time you walk out the door, and that needs to be a litmus test for good policy, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I tell our students all the time, we do residential courses in DC, and so that they can see how to address hunger in a systemic capacity, and or other poverty related issues in a systemic capacity. And I'm like, the difference in good and bad legislation is typically a prepositional phrase. And so one of the reasons that you want to have proximity to people in poverty, if this is an issue that you care about, is you need to be rooted in the reality of what's happening on a daily basis, and then also be able to take data and data analytics to be able to make a wise decision about what's happening that will have a positive benefit on people in poverty. But let me tell you a story. All right.
Yeah.
So here's a story of when America's at its best. Our team at the collaborative. So we've got kind of three distinct teams: a research team, a public service team, and a public policy team. Ideally, when we are doing interventions, we're working. All three teams are working in concert with each other, and that doesn't always happen that way, but ideally. And so some of our work is centered around identifying disproportionately affected populations who are experiencing hunger or food insecurity at a higher rate than other populations, and then developing targeted interventions for those populations that we have the potential to scale. And so we'll do pilots with USDA, federally funded pilots with USDA, typically towards that end. And so I had served on a congressional commission from 2014 to 2016, and our job was to find out why we had food insecurity in America, and then ultimately make some consensus recommendations for how to address it. But one of our consistent observations as we traveled border to border and coast to coast was that what was working to address hunger in urban and suburban America didn't translate to rural America. In rural communities, you might have a church, a post office, and a school, but you probably don't have all three, much less a grocery store, healthcare access, or whatever. So we were seeing higher rates of food insecurity in rural communities and harsher rates of food insecurity in rural communities, particularly for children when they got out of school in the summer.
Right.
So we developed an intervention in partnership with USDA, where the summer meal program required kids to go eat on site with other kids, and called a congregate meal site. And so that's the summer meal program we've had, for most of my adult life. And we've worked hard to try to create those summer meal site access points. A lot of states have over the past 10 or 15 years. But even we increased summer meal sites from 2,500 sites to 6,500 sites from 2010 to 2019 in Texas. And that tripled meal access from 8 million meals to 25 million meals, but that still only represented 15% of the population that needed access to meals.
Wow.
Right? So even though we did all that work, we still had a big gap that had to be addressed. And so what we did with USDA is we got them to pilot a non-congregate option. Since we couldn't get kids to meal programs in rural communities because there is no summer meal site, we had to get meal programs to kids. And so we launched a program we called Meals to You. We recruited 20 school districts in East and West Texas. Those school districts recruited 4,000 children to participate in a summer pilot. We mailed each child a week's worth of food. So 5 breakfasts, 5 lunches, 5 snacks per week over the course of the entire summer. It served about 500,000 meals and snacks to kids that had never received a USDA summer meal. That was one of about 24 programs that we were testing out at the time. It was one of our smaller programs, but the research team, led by some researchers at the Urban Institute, found that it had a greater impact on childhood food insecurity than the National School Lunch Program, which was the gold standard for addressing child hunger.
Right.
When we heard about that, Congress heard about it. They asked us to expand the program to Alaska and New Mexico for the next summer, but then the pandemic hit shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
When the pandemic hit, USDA asked us to expand the program nationwide, and so we ended up serving kids in 43 states plus Puerto Rico. About 270,000 children were on board the next year. Kids were so remote in Alaska, it literally took boats and planes and barges, and we even got reports of dog sled teams taking food boxes to kids. The kids in Arizona's Havasu tribal community at the bottom of the Grand Canyon received food boxes via mule teams.
Yeah.
And then children received food boxes via USPS and UPS everywhere else over the course of that summer. So we served about 40 million meals that second summer. And it ended up having 3 times the positive impact on childhood food insecurity for these kids in these very remote areas. So we were able to continue the pilot for a couple more years and then work with Congress in a bipartisan capacity to pass legislation to make this a permanent option. So now kids in rural America in perpetuity should be able to receive a non-congregate meal, a home-delivered meal, or a meal that they could pick up at a school and take and eat it at their home. To me, what the reason this is America at its best is that we didn't pack the boxes at Baylor.
No.
You know, we had industry. We partnered with industry who sourced the food, who packaged the food. It was the logistics sector of UPS and USPS that picked up the boxes and delivered them directly to people's front porches. UPS even launched a Go Brown program during the pandemic where they asked their employees to voluntarily move, if they were willing, didn't have to some of these very remote areas because they were getting more boxes in a week than they typically would in a month or even in a year.
Wow.
And they knew that these boxes of food were lifelines for children and their families. And so people voluntarily moved to help get food boxes out during the middle of a pandemic. We didn't even know about this until after the pandemic had subsided. We didn't ask them to do it. They just did it.
Wow.
Congress showed that they can work in a bipartisan capacity.
Yeah.
USDA and our state agencies and school districts played vital roles. Churches showed up to make sure that kids and their families were signed up, or they had those alternative sites where they did the drive-through sites, for a lot of kids to get access to it. So it showed us what America looks like at its best.
Right.
And it's when we embody FDR's quote of the test of our progress is whether we provide enough to those who have too little. When we're doing that, we're hitting on all of our cylinders as a nation.
Yeah.
When we're doing the opposite and we try to, circle the wagons, we decide who's in and who's out, and we start blaming the poor or scapegoating the poor for their plight, that's when we are 100% at our worst. And unfortunately, these days, and we've been careening towards this for a while, it seems like we're seeing more of that and less of those glimpses of hope that show us what it looks like when we're operating at our best.
No, and I appreciate that. And hunger is an issue that you mentioned that can cross political divides, religious divides. It can cross all the divides because I think at our core, we don't want children hungry. People never want to see a child go hungry. I think we all share that value. And so how to make that a reality, I think, is a issue that most people can get behind. And yet we, like you said, we're careening towards something different right now. And yep. I'm curious, we're recording this on July 3rd. Trump's legislative agenda is in the works of being passed. In regards to food insecurity, are there issues in Trump's legislative agenda that, our listeners need to be aware of that they could, because that agenda is huge. And so to understand all the different parts, are there parts that we need to be aware of that benefits and programs may be cut due to this? Yeah.
Well, if we go back to that Matthew 25 text, and we use it as a litmus test of sorts for, what does it mean to be a person of faith as it relates to people that are food insecure, or thirsty, or a prisoner, or a migrant, and so forth, and we hold that up against this current proposed legislation. What we know is that right now we're looking at least $200 billion worth of cuts to the SNAP program. And the SNAP program is the most vital program we have in America to address food insecurity. And so that will not just hurt people that are considered able-bodied adults without dependents. That is going to hurt primarily the working poor the most.
Yeah.
Because we will end up reducing eligibility. And so families who are working but underemployed and need this extra resource to try to be able to make ends meet, those will be the families that are impacted. Right now, if you're making the federal minimum wage at $7.25 an hour and you're able to get full-time employment 52 weeks out of the year, you're still bringing home less than $15,000 a year. That's not enough for rent, much less transportation costs, childcare expenses, medical costs, food, and so forth. And so families are forced to make trade-offs, and they have to decide what they're going to choose to pay for in a given month. So if you think about, I was hungry, you gave me something to eat, you
Yeah.
know. Well, these snap cuts that those are not correlative, right?
No.
Uh, Second is the Medicaid cuts. So we're talking about 17 million people losing healthcare access and rural hospitals closing.
Yeah.
So that just furthers inequities in our communities. So, you know, I was sick and you took care of me, right? Well, we're not doing that, and so those uh, that to me is painful. And then we're spending a lot of extra money to expel the migrant,
Yeah.
and so those are the people that are growing our food,
Hmm.
um, that are working on our ranches, that are working in our communities on a
Hmm.
day-to-day basis. They moved here to try to get a better life, not just for themselves, but for their kids and future generations. And so, having legal pathways forward are definitely needed.
Yeah.
Work permits, and so if we're doing the opposite, all these kinds of things are going to leave people who are already on the fringes of society dealing with more difficult circumstances. And for what? What do we gain? And so those are the things that we have to pay attention to when we're working on a policy level. Is what are the impacts, and so my assumption is by the time this airs is that piece of legislation will have passed and will have been enacted, and we'll start to be dealing with the ramifications of it.
And so as we think through, like, then the response, like, we don't want to respond out of anxiety or anger, or but this inward response motivated by love. Like, my wife and I are rereading Reaching Out by Henry Nouwen, and
Yeah.
his first move is from loneliness to solitude, but the last chapter on solitude is that as we engage in solitude, we're actually able to respond from a calmer place to the issues of our day. Like, it's a beautiful, like, my wife and I just read the chapter and we're like, this chapter speaks to so much of where we are, and how do we have this inner posture of strength and calmness in the time of so much anxiety. So as we think through a response, like, what can people begin to do, to love and to use Matthew 25 as our litmus test for how we want to shape not only our lives, but our communities?
Well, that's a great question. I think my wife has said to me before, I'm sure she's quoting somebody, but that wisdom is found kind of in the space between stimulus and response.
Yeah.
And I think right now what we're seeing is that we're all reacting to each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's just we're just caught in this perpetual state of reacting. And I think for us, I think when we think about the kingdom of God within, it's centering ourselves, recognizing that we need to operate from center.
Yeah.
We need to connect with the kingdom from within, and then be strategic about how we choose to act and engage. Just showing up to the next march isn't necessarily going to bring about justice.
Mm-hmm.
It may not bend a crooked path straight. Sometimes the key to justice is through an Excel file, making sure that every child receives that food box over the course of the summer, so that they can eat.
Yeah.
But if you're going to engage in policy, engage it in a thoughtful way. And typically, I would just say most of our elected officials did not develop expertise before they became elected in areas where they are addressing hunger and poverty, even if they want and recognize that this is a value that they want to address. And so people who do have proximity to the problem, people who have been working in this space, you need to build a relationship with your member and invite them in, right? They probably don't know everything that you know, so take them to your nonprofit organization to meet the families that you serve and have gotten to know, in your tenure. Help them know the strategies that you've identified that are improving the quality of life for folks. No point in demonizing particular individuals, because I think that's the big thing, is that we don't want to just create progressive fundamentalism, right?
No, right.
Where we decide who's in and who's out. I think what I love about the Christian faith is that it kind of, we're inherently all, you know, sinful, right?
Yeah.
We're also inherently all created in the image of God, so we got those two things that are held in juxtaposition. But it's like, I really don't, I can't stand from a place of judgment,
No.
because I know that I'm not checking off all the boxes,
Right.
so that means that we can be inherently invitational, that we don't
Hmm.
have to decide based upon we don't have to create a litmus test of who's for, or who's for or against the cause, right?
Yeah.
Everybody can be invited. Maybe they haven't been good on the issue before, but they can still be invited to join the cause at this point. So I would say build relational rapport with your members, so that the next time these big votes happen, they vote differently.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's going to be important. And I would say spend time getting to know somebody that you disagree with politically,
Hmm.
since that seems to be the divide right now that we've created in our nation, is through political disagreement,
Yeah.
and assume that what they say to you is true.
Hmm.
So I don't care what your politics are. Find a friend this year, build that you disagree with, or find somebody you disagree with, and build a friendship rather,
Right.
and assume that what they're telling you is true, and then ask that they do the same when you're speaking to them,
Hmm.
and get to know why they believe what they believe, and don't be so quick to rush to judgment. And I think if we start doing those kinds of things, the small acts and the big acts can start to uh, break down those barriers that we've built, and make those crooked paths straight, that our our people in poverty are desperate for us to do.
Right.
So
Well, you've given us a lot to unpack and to think through, some hope, some challenge. So I really, really appreciate all that your wisdom and experience you bring to this. Yeah, it's been a joy.
yeah, well, Andrew, you're very thoughtful. I appreciate your questions, and your the thoughtful way in which you engage this subject, kind of looking at the correlation of food and faith, and accessibility to food to all God's creatures, and look forward to seeing all of the different conversations that you're having with people in this lane.
Yeah.
I think this is a really fruitful conversation, no pun intended. But I appreciate you reaching out and including me in your podcast. It is you're creating a big table, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And some questions I ask all of my guests to wrap up. The first one's some fun ones after this one, but what's the story you want the church to tell?
Wow, that's a big question. Uh, uh, that is a big question. I mean, I think I would say, I grew up in in a Baptist kind of evangelical setting, and we talked a lot about Jesus's birth and death and
Hmm.
resurrection, and obviously those are all three very critical moments in Jesus's life, and in how we understand the Christian faith and our relationship to God. But he also lived on earth
Hmm.
for a while, and I would just say, spend time finding out what he did and who he did it with while he was here, and then pay attention to that story, and then go emulate it in their communities.
Wow, beautiful. Some fun questions then to wrap up. What's one food you refuse to eat?
We were talking about this recently. I'm not oysters.
Okay.
I can't. I don't know, man. I don't think I can stomach oysters. Certainly
Fair.
raw oysters. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be one. What about you?
Um, there's very little, but when I was in China, there was I was served a plate of chicken kidneys that were like stewed and boiled, and they weren't the most delightful thing I put in my mouth. And it's only recently I realized like that was actually a very honorable dish they served us because it took a lot of chickens, to get that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so like that, oh wait, so I still don't appreciate it, but I appreciate, like to recognize if I'm served a dish like that, the honor they're bestowing on me.
Yep. 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 That's a good one. That's a good one.
On the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Wow, that's a good question. I had some red snapper this spring that was prepared by a chef with kind of Louisiana Cajun roots, and I'm not a huge fish eater, and it blew me away. It's
Yeah.
one of the best meals I've had in recent memory. So
That's cool.
I'm going to say that red snapper dish, Cajun red snapper dish, was delicious.
Yeah.
What
Awesome.
about you?
I vacillate. I've been served a white truffle risotto that was by a chef mentor. That was phenomenal. And then my best friend was at both of these. And so, but then we went to the Donut Man in Glendora, California, and there's a peach donut he has during the peak of peach season that we took a bite sitting on a grassy knoll, and we both looked at each other and giggled and cried. It's one of the most profound food experiences I've ever had. And I've had the peach donut again, but it's never done that to me. But in that moment, there was just this euphoria of fresh donut, fresh peaches that commingled into something that was greater than the sum of its parts.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Well, we're headed to higher elevation, and we have noticed that everything seems to taste better in cooler climates at higher elevation, and
Right.
And so we're looking forward to that. We're very, very much so. Well, thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to be a part of your podcast, and look forward to connecting with you on your journey here, and getting you connected to other cool folks at Baylor. Glad that you talked to my buddy Malcolm.
Yeah.
He's a dynamo.
He is.
What a gift to have him at Baylor.
No, it is. And if people want to learn more about what you're up to, what's the website for what you're doing through Baylor?
Go to hungerandpoverty.org.
Okay.
Go to hungerandpoverty.org, and they can find out how to connect with us and get involved in the work and export the work that we do into their communities. And so we'd love to connect with anybody that feels like this might be a meaningful pathway forward for them. We'd love to get them organizing in their communities or in Washington. And glad you're connected with my friends at Bread for the World. So they're doing great work in DC.
Yep. And so thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.